Welcome to this web talk titled Beyond Networks, Militias and Tribes, Rethinking the EU's Counter-Smuggling Policy and Response. My name is Alia Fakhry. I'm an associate researcher with the German Council on Foreign Relations, or DGAP in its German acronym, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today virtually to the DGAP. So in a few words, the German Council on Foreign Relations is a non-partisan, non-government foreign policy think tank based in Berlin. And at the migration program, we conduct research to provide actionable recommendations to policymakers in Germany and in Europe. Our current work focuses on two main strands, which are German and European return policies on the one hand, and European Euro-African relationships on migration. Today's event is organized with the support of the German Council on Foreign Relations, but also of the Barcelona-based European Institute for the Mediterranean, the IEMED, and their Euromesco network. Thank you very much to all of you participants for joining us today for today's session. Thanks to our panelists and our moderator for being here. And many thanks to my colleagues as well at DGAP and Euromesco for their support. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's session, Dr. Gabriela Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez is a social-cultural anthropologist with a background in law enforcement. In her research, she specializes in border enforcement, the facilitation of irregular migration, and the crimes associated with these practices in different contexts in the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And her work relies on community-centered, rights-based approaches and draws from direct interactions and contributions of smuggling facilitators to reduce the gaps between the people on the move and the policies that target them. So Gabriela, thanks a lot for being here and taking this role as moderator, and I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Alia, and thanks to all of you for joining us from all over the place this afternoon. My name is Gabriela Sanchez, and it is, my pleasure to join this fantastic panel. We were just commenting right before the start with it. It's all women, so we are very excited that the conversation can go into that direction. And about the event, well, this debate takes place in the framework of Euromesco Connecting the Dots project, which is co-funded by the EU and IEMED, who is part of our supporters for what was this entire policy study. The project contributes to inclusive and evidence-based policymaking by fostering research and recommendations in relation with the European Neighborhood Policy South priorities, with a special focus on economic development, migration, and security. And this is a specific project that part of the presentations and part of the data that we're going to be discussing today aims to connect the dots between diverse stakeholders, the EU, its southern neighbors, and the wider region. It also seeks to develop a wide range of research and dialogue and dissemination activities. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. We also welcome all of you. We have people from the Commission joining us today, people from IOM GEMDAC, and also from Facebook. We're very happy to have you join us today. And as part of the conversation, we are very excited that we were able to put together, or that thanks to Alia as well too, for putting together all of this fantastic speakers together, for bringing such a great team together today. So we're going to start with Sanna Kuukka, who will present the EU approach to counter-smuggling, including the forthcoming action plan, which has been very well discussed by several, by the circles of policy making. We have, of course, Marcia Rango, who will speak about the context and current trends of regular migration and smuggling in the Mediterranean. Our host, Alia Fakhry, who will present the concrete case of counter-smuggling counter-smuggling operations in Niger and the consequences on local communities, which was part of it's included in the report Beyond Networks, Militias and Tribes, Rethinking EU Counter-Smuggling Policy and Response, which is forthcoming through Euromasco. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Ms. Sanna Kuukka, who is, just allow me a very quick presentation or introduction here, is the head of sector at the Directorate General for Home Affairs at the European Commission, where she leads the work on irregular migration and counter-smuggling, including the development of the EU Action Plan against migrant smuggling. She has worked for more than 15 years with the European Commission, including on the Internal Security Fund for the MFF 2021-2027 at DG Home, on security research at DG Grow, and on the Galileo program at DG Trend. So without any further ado, Sanna, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Can you all hear me? Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And also for Alia for sharing the study with me prior to the event. It was very interesting and thought-provoking reading as I quickly flicked through it actually this morning to be preparing for this event. Let me start with, before getting into the details maybe of the action plan a bit more, setting up the overall policy framework within which we are working, which is of course set in the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which came out last year, which sets out a comprehensive approach to migration, bringing together all the different aspects of the policy with an aim to create a long-term and sustainable system for managing migration and asylum to the Union. The Pact is based, of course, on the fundamental fact that all policy actions affect each other. So if you take one action here, it will have an impact on something else. And the Pact also foresees that we will need to work and build on our relationship with third countries. The external and internal dimension of the migration are intrinsically interlinked, and we will have to work together with third countries because it has a direct impact on the policy inside the Union. The Pact also identifies that addressing root causes of migration and bringing them together with migrant smuggling and helping refugees residing in third countries and supporting well-management legal migration are all key parts of this comprehensive approach. Furthermore, overall on this policy framework, furthermore, we have the Union security strategy, which also highlighted that migrant smuggling is often intertwined with other forms of organized crime, and especially trafficking in human beings. And and the new strategy. So in April, just 2 months ago, the Commission adopted a new strategy to tackle both organized crime and the trafficking in human beings. And they have both the same time period as the future action plan on migrant smuggling. It highlights the fact that all these policy aspects are very interlinked, and we will need to work together to address the things. Let me now finally turn into the new action plan, which was the main topic and why I was invited to be here today. The Commission will adopt, as announced in the Pact, the new action plan against migrant smuggling. It is planned, the exact date is maybe not sure, it hopefully comes in September this year. It will, of course, build on the previous action plan, which was adopted in 2015 and covered a broad range of topics, both inside the EU and in relation to third countries. And we consider that it has been quite successful, and therefore we will build on that. The new action plan will further strengthen cooperation on information exchange between member states, different EU agencies and third countries. And I understood from Alia that what you want me to specifically focus in terms of the action plan is what we are foreseeing for the kind of external dimension of the action plan. The Pact quite clearly says that combating migrant smuggling is a common challenge, requiring international cooperation and coordination, as well as effective border management. We organized a conference in July last year with the EU and several African countries, and they clearly confirmed that it's a mutual issue that we will all need to work together. We will try to stimulate further cooperation through what we call targeted counter-migrant smuggling partnership, which will be mutually beneficial to both sides. And we will target both countries of origin and transit and help them in the capacity building in terms of law enforcement and judicial cooperation, and as well as build on existing cooperation and operational activities. The action plan is meant to adopt a whole of the route approach so that we will not just pick certain things, but look at how the whole chain of migrants pass through different countries towards the EU. In this context, cooperation with the different EU agencies such as Europol, Eurojust, and Frontex is a key issue. I wanted just to look through some of the actions that we are currently supporting, which will be also key parts of the cooperation in the future. And this is what we call currently common operational partnerships. It's a bit maybe a fancy title for projects which we are supporting through EU funding. But they address very often both migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. We have, for example, I have a few project examples just that you understand the type of actions that we are doing. We have one of these common operational partnership in North Africa against migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. It started last year, and we are providing 7.5 million euros for this project. We have other projects also in Africa, focusing on different countries and supporting things like the AFRIPOL, which is the African Union Mechanism for Police Cooperation. And because we think that these have worked quite well and we are able to kind of scale the approach to the needs of the third countries, we have started in March this year 3 new projects, one in the Gambia, one kind of networking of existing projects, trying to pull together what's worked best between different common operational partnership and joint investigations teams in West and Central Africa. And finally, a new project looking into the migrant smuggling activities in the Turkey and the Western Balkans. These are basically the ones that I just mentioned are projects that we have financed through DG Home funds. There are, of course, examples of the EU's external funds, which have also supported similar activities in different countries, mostly in Africa. Another example, which is what we consider a kind of success story of the previous action plan, is the cooperation of the European immigration liaison officers, which are basically liaison officers sent by member states to different countries throughout the world. There are some also employed by the Commission and some of the EU agencies. So the new regulation looks into how this cooperation can help member states to cooperate with the third countries in various aspects. It's looking at smuggling, it's also looking at the return. So this network will bring a key kind of, it makes the cooperation concrete, and I mean, gives us information on what's happening in the countries in place. And finally, we have something which we've been funding also from DG Home, is what we call information campaigns, which is basically trying to reach the migrants or possible migrants and kind of offering alternatives to irregular migration, explaining what are the possibilities for legal migration, and maybe highlighting a bit the risks of migrant smuggling networks. In terms of the preparation of the action plan, like I said, we're still drafting it. It will come out in the autumn. And in that context, maybe it's important to highlight that we have still the public consultation open. It has just been extended and it goes now until the 11th of June. So if somebody has not yet taken the opportunity to provide us with their ideas, this is just a kind reminder that we're very happy to receive any suggestions. And let me maybe say, not to conclude, but to say that the action plan will, of course, not just address cooperation with third countries. We are also looking at the secondary movements inside the EU and legalization of resident status, for example, which are issues that happens within the union, and also there's migrant smuggling is all sometimes very, very clearly present. I think that's it. I don't want to take more time explaining shortly where we are. I'm happy to take any questions and to participate in the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this very quick but very comprehensive, narrative in terms of cooperation. I think that very few times I've heard, like specific agencies and also the project. So thank you so much for sharing those with us today. And I'm sure there will be questions at the end of during the Q&A. So next we are going to hear from Marcia Rango, who leads the work on data innovation and capacity building at IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center, GMDAC, in Berlin. Over the past 3 years, Marcia has managed a program focused on migration on the Central Mediterranean route, as part of which she co-edited the volume Migration in West and North Africa and Across the Mediterranean, which everybody should read. And prior to joining GMDAC, Marcia worked at IOM's research unit in Geneva and as a research assistant at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. She has also experienced working at the European Parliament in Brussels and in the private sector. So Marcia, really, really nice to see you, this afternoon. So
thank you so much, Gabriela.
Yours. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, that was frozen. Thank you so much for this kind of introduction. Thanks to DGAP, Alia, for the invitation, and it's great to be part of this all-female panel this afternoon. Thanks also to all of you who joined us this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a few slides. I hope this works. Let me know, give me a sign if this is can you see the slides? Perfect. So thanks again. And what I would like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is really touch upon 3 key points in relation to irregular migration and migrant smuggling, with a focus on West and North Africa and the Mediterranean crossing. So one is the data and evidence that we do have. The second point is what we need, what evidence and data we need to better understand these trends. And the third point is why and how this matters, and particularly in view of the revised action plan on migrant smuggling and the EU's overall approach in the next 5 years. And much of the evidence that I'm going to present is actually compiled in the volume that Gabriela just mentioned, titled Migration in West and North Africa and Across the Mediterranean, which includes various contributions from IOM colleagues from several IOM offices in Africa and Europe, international organizations, research institutes, and civil society organizations. So I'm really really quoting a lot of the research that you will find in the volume as well. So first of all, definition, I don't think we really need to go into detail about this. I just put the definition of migrant smuggling up there. It's relatively recent, from the Protocol Against the Smuggling of Migrants by Land, Sea and Air and the Palermo Convention. Smuggling, so the procurement of irregular, unofficial or undeclared entry into a country different from the person's country for a material benefit, which should not be conflated with human trafficking, which does not necessarily involve border crossing, is not consensual, and requires an element of exploitation. So consent, transnationality are elements characterizing migrant smuggling that are not found in trafficking. In practice, this distinction can be hard to make and is hard to make in certain cases where there are elements of exploitation and abuse emerging during migrant journeys and transit and destination, even in the presence of initial consent. But it is an important distinction to be made. Due to, now coming to the key data sources, sort of due to the hidden nature of the phenomenon, obviously there are no reliable global statistics on the numbers of migrants who are smuggled every year. There are data on some migration corridors. We're going to look at this data that provides an indication of the scale of migrant smuggling. But even beyond smuggling, just irregular migration, accurate estimates of undocumented migration are also difficult to produce. And this is not only because undocumented migrants go unrecorded in official statistics, but also because of the changes in status depending on law and policy changes, which makes it very difficult to have an accurate picture and timely picture, comprehensive of undocumented migration, both in terms of numbers at one point in time and flows. And so for data on irregular migration, we're really relying on proxy indicators from national administrative data sources, such as apprehensions in the country, apprehensions at the border, applications for regularization programs, etc., which measure compliance, obviously, with migration legislation and not irregular migration per se. And so these changes have to be in data and in trends have to be interpreted very carefully because of this. When it comes to irregular migration in West and North Africa, to North Africa and across the Mediterranean, there's two key sources that have significantly increased the availability of data and evidence on these dynamics in the absence of accurate, timely, and comprehensive data from national sources. And these are IOM's displacement tracking matrix and the mixed migration monitoring mechanism initiative of FORMI. And just a brief look at these data sources, because a lot of the data that I will be presenting also comes from these two data sources, and a lot of the data in the volume comes from these two data sources. We have sort of these two systems, quite complementary in many ways. DTM have 47 components and it tracks both stocks, so the numbers of migrants or travelers in key locations and in certain locations, certain countries at one point in time, but also flows and movements across key transit locations in West Africa and Central Africa and to North Africa, but also elsewhere. I'm going to be focusing on this area. And there's also information about the profiles, basic profiles of migrants, and with the surveys, even more detailed information, individual level data, really about socioeconomic profiles, journey experiences, future intentions, but also some thematic modules such as on instances of exploitation and abuse during the journey, which can serve to inform programmatic responses by IOM and other partners. And the FORMI system by the Mixed Migration Center is in many ways complementary. And as I said, then it's mainly qualitative information based on in-depth individual interviews with migrants and also smugglers. And the point I would like to make here is that to correctly interpret the figures coming from IOM's displacement tracking matrix, DTM and FORMI, it is important to keep in mind also the limitations of these data sources, just like any other data source on migration, but particularly on the topics of irregular migration and smuggling, because some of these limitations are inherent to the operational context in which these data are collected, the time constraints, and the geographic coverage, and are therefore, there's an inherent selectivity of places, of people that are interviewed, of the informants that are interviewed, of the time period, which can affect the representativity of the data. So this is something to be kept in mind. So very quickly, first of all, let me just put some figures in context, because aside from the DTM and the FORMI, we also have estimates of international migrant stocks from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And whenever we're talking about irregular migration and migrant smuggling from Africa to Europe, it is always very important to put these figures in context, both historical and geographical context. So I will go very quickly here, because this might, of course, be known to most of you, I'm sure. But it is something that the fact that most migration from Africa stays within Africa, and particularly when we're talking about the Western Africa region, which is the region with the highest intra-regional mobility in Africa. It's a really sticky misperception that we have in public debates about migration in Europe, that the focus on migration from Africa to Europe, which is quite problematic, because this contextual understanding is key to inform policies that are ultimately sustainable and effective. So I will go just very quickly here, but the intra-regional mobility being very high is both confirmed by the estimates of migrant stocks from the UN DESA. So most of the migrants residing in West Africa are actually born in other countries in West Africa, and also estimates based on IOM's displacement tracking matrix, with 92% of the movements recorded at key transit points within West Africa being directed to other countries within the region. And there's a long history of migration, obviously, between West Africa and North African countries, with Libya and Algeria being key, historically key destination countries for foreign workers from across sub-Saharan Africa in the Sahel. And this is still the case despite ongoing conflict and political instability in Libya, with hundreds of thousands of migrants currently residing and working in Libya. This is also something to be kept in mind when talking about irregular migration and migrant smuggling in this region. Also, to put some of these figures in context, what do we know about mixed migration trends in West and Central Africa in 2020 more generally? And this is based on IOM's regional mobility map being done by the colleagues at the regional office in Dakar. We have seen an increased intra-regional mobility despite the initial drop in COVID-19 due to COVID-19, border closures, mobility restrictions in the first few months of the pandemic, an increase in intra-regional mobility right before and also after this initial period of the pandemic. The second point is the reactivation of the Western Western Africa Atlantic route, so from the West African coast to the Canary Islands, which has been partly a response to border closures and mobility restrictions. This route was active already in 2006, but had then been sort of abandoned for other routes across the Mediterranean. And from late 2019, it's actually been reactivated with about 23,000 arrivals to the Canary Islands from the West African coast just in 2020. And it's a very dangerous route because of the long journeys and a more dangerous route than other routes on the mainland, despite obviously the dangers of crossing the desert. And some possible causes for this increase in crossings to the Canary Islands, it's definitely the greater difficulty of traveling along migratory routes from West and Central Africa, with border closures for most of the year, or to Libya and Algeria, stricter migration policies, border control policies, increased controls, and also forced returns of migrants from Algeria and Libya. And the economic impact of COVID-19 probably has also been a factor increasing crossings to the Canary Islands, forcing migrants and young migrants with more limited opportunities, particularly in agriculture and fishery industry, to migrate. We've also seen a declining trend of migration from West and Central Africa to North Africa over the past 3 years, so between 2018 and 2020. And this is also possibly due to stricter border controls on this route. So this is based on DTM data on a total of 1.5 million individual movements recorded across key transit points at the borders between Mali, Niger, Chad, and Algeria and Libya in these years. And it really highlights the fact that migration routes also can quickly adapt following border closures, emerging economic opportunities, and also increased policies of surveillance at borders. So many of these movements, we're seeing this declining trend, but many of these movements might also obviously be unrecorded or go through alternative locations that might be more dangerous for migrants. Now, a bit of a historical perspective also, or just an overview of cross-Mediterranean undocumented migration to Europe. So migration from Africa to Europe across the Mediterranean obviously has received a lot of attention, given it is a continuing, persistent humanitarian emergency, and it has also caused political crisis in Europe. But numbers are relatively small compared to other migration, both regular migration from Africa to outside the continent, and also migration within Africa, as we've seen. So migration across the Mediterranean and the smuggling business as we know it began in the 1970s, roughly with the introduction of visa requirements for nationals of North African countries that until then had migrated for temporary work reasons to countries in Europe. And the introduction obviously incentivized permanent settlement of these workers in Europe, family reunification for their family members from North African countries to countries in Europe, and also the development of the smuggling business as we have come to know it today. And so this is just showing, obviously, I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but it's important again to put these figures in historical context and highlighting how the increase in Mediterranean crossings that we've seen starting mostly in 2014 and then 2015 are sort of these two different kinds, if we allow me this broad simplification. The central Mediterranean route, this has been largely a reflection of structural development, social transformation processes in countries across sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa as well. And on the Eastern Mediterranean routes from Turkey to Greece, obviously it's more movements related to seeking protection and seeking asylum due to obviously conflict in the Middle East. And so the evolution also of this crossing reflects these differences. And between now and more recently, between 2017 and 2020, arrivals to Europe have witnessed a continuous drop with the number of migrants arriving irregularly decreasing by about 50% between 2017 and 2020. And while Greece was the main country through which irregular migrants and asylum seekers reached Europe in 2019, it was only the third country of arrival in 2020, behind Spain and Italy. And another thing to notice also is that the share of West and Central African nationals among all migrants that migrated on this route across the Mediterranean over time decreased. It used to be about 40% of all arrivals to Europe in 2017, down to 13% in about 2020, which could be explained by multiple factors, including stricter border surveillance, enhanced and strengthened cooperation agreements also on border controls, mobility restrictions due to COVID-19, livelihood opportunities that have also decreased, and higher risk of travels as well. So despite the reduction in Mediterranean crossings, people continue to die or go missing in the Mediterranean, with more than 20,000, or at least 20,000 actually, lives lost in the Mediterranean since 2014, which is when the Missing Migrants Project, and I saw some colleagues also from the Missing Migrants Project team joined back on the line, since the Missing Migrants Project started collecting and compiling data systematically, information systematically on this phenomenon. There are at least 575 deaths. You can see here an evolution of information on fatalities across the Mediterranean from 2014 to 2021. And this does not include the deaths on the Atlantic route that I was mentioning to the Canary Islands, where the increase in departures actually was accompanied by an increase in fatalities with at least 1,500 deaths since 2014, but just 850 in 2020, and 126 deaths on this route so far only this year. And obviously, I mean, it's we're tragically becoming numb to these numbers, but it's always crucial to remember that we're talking about men, women, children with their aspirations and lives, and family members also who are left behind and who may never know the fate of these loved ones, of their loved ones. This is a real tragedy, and the tragedy of our time. Now, what do we know? I'm looking at the clock as well, but what do we know about the impact of counter-smuggling efforts on the risks and vulnerabilities faced by migrants on traveling on this route, particularly West and North Africa and then across the Mediterranean? And so here I would just like to highlight a few points that emerged from the edited volume. One is from a chapter by Luca Raineri on the unintended consequences of the so-called war on smuggling, as the former Commissioner Avramopoulos put it in 2015. And the fact that the increasing criminalization of irregular migration may actually have led to an increase of two incentives to a criminal organization of irregular migration and the smuggling business by raising the entry barrier basically for smugglers that used to be small scale, perhaps part of local communities, and using facilitation of travel as a livelihood opportunity into criminal organizations of irregular migration, where also the trust element between smuggler and migrant obviously is may not be there, and so opportunities for deception, abuse, and exploitation, and so human trafficking, the overlap between trafficking and smuggling becomes more likely. We've also seen increased pushbacks, particularly during the COVID pandemic, COVID-19 at the EU borders, with at least 40,000 migrants and asylum seekers pushed back at EU borders during COVID-19, according to a Guardian analysis, and also over 15,000 migrants intercepted and returned to Libya since the start of the pandemic. Just this year, about 8,000 migrants were intercepted and returned to Libya, and official numbers on migrants in detention centers in Libya are up to about 4,000. So there are thousands of people, thousands of migrants that we actually don't, they're unaccounted for, that we don't know, we don't have any information on, and but we're sure that they may require protection and assistance. So this should also be considered, that cooperation with third countries like Libya, like support to the Libyan Coast Guard and capacity building needs to be accompanied by appropriate safeguards to protect migrants' fundamental rights. And IOM and UNHCR have also been stressing that migrants should not be intercepted and returned to Libya, which is not a safe port, where migrants are subject to arbitrary detention and other human rights violations. And then lastly, it's also, I think, obviously, this is just a chart also showing the increased risks and fatality risk across the Mediterranean because of the increased criminalization of search and rescue operation by non-governmental organizations in the Mediterranean, a risk that has peaked in the period with where NGO presence at sea was basically at its lowest. And so these kinds of risks and the unintended consequences of these policies have to be taken into account, just as well as the destruction of assets, for instance, by smugglers, and which have led to a resort to more unseaworthy boats also to cross the Mediterranean. And then lastly, last element that I'm going to mention about the evidence that we do have and that we should consider is also the complexity of smuggling and smugglers' profiles and operations. And so the need to really nuance the discussion on migrant smuggling and contextualize the phenomenon in order to devise really appropriate and sustainable responses. And here there's a lot of research to draw upon, including by our dear moderator, Gabriela Sanchez, who's one of the top experts on this. So I'm sure that I'm not saying anything new to her. But there's also data from the Mixed Migration Center. It is presented in the volume. And here are two charts basically showing the two sides of this discussion. One is the fact that smugglers are often cited by, this is based on thousands of refugees and migrants interviewed in Libya and North Africa and Libya, and 3 countries in West Africa. Smugglers being cited as the main provider of assistance to migrants, but at the same time, also as the ones and the subjects that actually do perpetrate abuses and do exploit migrants as well, particularly when it comes to responses from North Africa. And here you can see a difference, you can see it between responses given on different kinds of abuse perpetrated by smugglers in North Africa, which are much more prominent compared to West Africa, although there are differences depending on the countries. but as well as providers of services, which might also point to the fact that actually migrants may be more vulnerable because they may not have access to other forms of other providers of services as well. And another side of the complexity of smuggling, which probably we'll discuss later as well with Gabriela, is that attributing smuggling to just organized criminal networks, which is definitely an aspect that is there, may lead to sort of this simplistic view that of facilitation of mobility in Libya and beyond. And actually findings by Gabriela and Vijakili and others have shown that many times smugglers and the people behind these journeys are also members of marginalized, impoverished communities who have historically relied on smuggling as a livelihood opportunity in the absence of alternative economic opportunities as well. And so we have to make this distinction and consider these nuances in any effective response to smuggling. I'm not sure how long we have, Gabriela, but if you allow me, maybe I've mentioned a few of the gaps, maybe just moving to the conclusions and some implications for policy, some final thoughts on why and how all of this data and this evidence gaps also matter for policy in view of the upcoming EU action plan on migrant smuggling and the revision for the next 5 years. One is that we need to act on the evidence that we do have. And the second point is obviously improving evidence and insisting investing on the production of data and evidence on what we don't yet know and where we need to shed more light. So on the first aspect, migration scholars and experts have really been insisting on the same aspects for a long time. And it's time to shift towards implementation or nothing, close to nothing will change. So smuggling will continue. Migrants and countries alike will continue to face, suffer the consequences of these policies and an excessive focus on counter-smuggling relative to facilitating safe, orderly, and regular migration that can benefit all countries and migrants alike. So one is the need to place really migrants' right at the center of any counter-smuggling effort. And counter-smuggling alone also is unlikely to be successful without other measures, legal migration pathways, expanded migrant protection and assistance, development intervention. And so cooperation with countries of origin and transit must go beyond improving the capacities for border control and criminalization and place the safeguard and the protection of migrant rights at the center, including access to asylum protection and complementary pathways for protection. And also recognizing the complexity, as I said, of not treating smuggling and migrant smuggling as a monolithic sort of reality, understanding where the demand for migrant services, smuggling services comes from. So the historical evolution of irregular migration, without a due consideration of this context, things are unlikely to change and might only get worse. And there's also sort of this premise, just the last point that I'm going to mention of the credibility of the EU migration management system is that people with no legitimate claims to protection will stop traveling to Europe irregularly because they know that they will be returned. And so it's basically a deterrence policy, which overlooks all the research on the drivers of migration on these routes and the structural really causes, developmental causes of this migration, the risks and vulnerabilities faced by migrants in countries of origin and on en route, which brings them to what many of them know very well, to be extremely dangerous journeys. And so a comprehensive and ultimately effective counter-smuggling approach can not only focus on the supply side, it has to focus on the demand side to promote coherence also with other sides of migration management and policy. I'm glad that Sanna mentioned this also in her remarks. So thanks very much. I'm going to leave it at that and looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcia, for this presentation and also for the for reminding all of us, there's precisely this need for a more nuanced perspective of what the facilitation of irregular migration, is all about, and also for helping us move right beyond what has been long this dynamic of the binaries. It's like the good smuggler, the bad smuggler, or everybody's organized, or everybody is part of transnational organized crime. And once again, emphasize the excellent work that our colleagues from the Mixed Migration Center, for example, have developed for MI, DTM, and how that has really advanced because of its nuance, how the data has been able to advance our collective understanding of migrant smuggling. So thank you so much for bringing all that up. Next, and precisely along those lines, for the need for a more nuanced, more grounded and a perspective that really draws from the views of the people who experience the processes of criminalization, the labeling of migrant smuggling, on the ground. We have our, hostess, Alia Fakhry. Alia works with DGAP's migration program, where she coordinates a multi-author study on African migration policies and debates. Previously, Alia worked at the International Center for Migration Policy Development in Malta, where she supported Mediterranean cities, and their policy work on migrant and refugee integration. She also worked as a consultant on urban migration in North Africa for UN Habitat, and contributed to communication for development for CD at UNICEF Senegal. Prior to that, she supported academic research projects on forced migration at the French Institute for the Near East in Lebanon and Jordan. Alia's presentation today is based on her contribution to the Euromesco report, which examines blind spots of counter-smuggling efforts in Niger. So Alia, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela, and thanks to Marcia and Sanna as well for the inputs. I guess we could also just stop here. I think it was very interesting to hear from both of you, and I hope my presentation, as Gabriela said, will hopefully close the circle a little bit on going from what we want to do about smuggling, what we do know about smuggling, and what we've done so far about smuggling, and so what we can learn about all of this. I'll try to share my screen. Hopefully this is working. Yes, super, thank you. Right. Sorry, let me just try and start the. Right. Okay. So yeah, as Gabriela just said, my presentation is based on research into the context of Niger and on counter-smuggling policies and their impact on local communities in Niger. This presentation is based on research findings that were published in a Euromesco policy study on migrant smuggling in the Southern Mediterranean, also coordinated by our moderator today, Gabriela. I wanted to focus on the case of Niger, which has received a lot of attention already. There's already a lot out there. But I thought it was such an interesting case, and I actually called it this textbook case of EU counter-smuggling policies. We can see it as perhaps an ideal type of what EU counter-smuggling, the EU counter-smuggling approach looks like in practice when implemented in third partner countries. And like any good textbook case, I think the example of Niger brings about also interesting learnings and recommendations for the future of EU counter-smuggling policies. I know that there's also a lot of expertise in this room about Niger and other countries in the area, so I also look forward to the discussion later. I wanted to start my presentation by showing you what we can call a before and after shot. This chart shows you flow data that is collected by the IOM, precisely the DTM that Marcia just mentioned. So this is flow data that is collected at different data collection points in Niger, and it gives us an indication of how many people have reportedly entered the country and how many people have reportedly left the country by land at a specific time. sorry. So if we look at looking at the graph, if we look at the outgoing flows in the lighter gray line, we see that there's been a drastic decrease between 2016 and 2020, a tenfold decrease actually over a period of 4 years, which in Europe was praised as a success, as I quote, for example, former European Parliament President Tajani. So what happened exactly in these 4 years? How did we go from the higher side of the charts in 2016 to 2020? We know that Niger has received a lot of attention from the European Commission and European member states, especially after 2015. And the reason for that is that the Commission identified Niger as a country of transit for West African migrants on their way to Europe. It is true that Niger is located at the crossroads between the Sahel and North Africa, also located at the northmost border of the ECOWAS movement area. And so according to this narrative of transit migration, the data on this chart should in fact show us the so-called transit migrants, people traveling from Western Africa to the Mediterranean through Niger with the help of local smugglers. And policymakers, as I said, in Europe, but also in Niger, set out to curb the flows of irregular transit migrants with counter-smuggling policies. So how did this happen in practice? Sorry. Great. We've seen a joint or two-pronged approach by the European Union and its member states and the government of Niger. On the EU side, we've had the introduction of a migration partnership framework in 2016. I'm not going to detail so much all of these measures. I'm happy to do so later in discussion if needed. The EU-CAP Sahel Niger mission, so the CSDP mission in Niger, so its mandate and its budget expand to cover the fight against migrant smuggling. We've had member states, namely France and Spain, redeploy joint investigation teams. And we've had a lot of funding from the UTF, the EU Trust Fund for Africa, as well as other funding instruments supporting projects mainly in two areas, migration governance and border management. So all in all, a rather comprehensive approach that really showed the full scope of the EU external action portfolio. And Niger on its end pushed through a piece of legislation, namely the Law 36 of 2015 on migrant smuggling, that remains until this day rather criticized, both in Niger, but also was quite heavily criticized by the UN Special Reporter for Human Rights following his visit to Niger. And the reason for this criticism is that the law actually goes beyond the provisions of the protocol against the smuggling of migrants of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, or the Palermo Protocol that Marty also mentioned earlier. So the law criminalizes the facilitation of irregular migration. This is at the heart of the protocol, but this was already the case actually under pre-existing Nigerian legislation. What this legislation introduces are three main offenses that can be seen as problematic. The first is that it not only criminalizes the facilitation of irregular migration, but also the attempt to facilitate irregular migration. It also criminalizes facilitation regardless of the presence of a transnational organized criminal network. And thirdly, it also introduces an offense for the facilitation of irregular exit. So that would mean the irregular entry into a neighbor country, to Niger. So now, what do we know about the people that these policies target, namely the smugglers or the facilitators, and what happened to them after law enforcement? So let's perhaps go back to who these people are and how they used to operate before law enforcement operations came into play. So on this map, you can see the main routes that connect Niger to Algeria and Libya. And the history of these routes goes back to the 8th century, but things really accelerated in the 60s when the industrialization in Algeria, Nigeria, and Libya these economies started supplying neighbor countries with manufactured goods, and at the same time started recruiting wage labor. And so the transporters that were providing transport services for goods also starting offering these services for people, namely migrant workers, on their way to Algeria and Libya and back to Niger. So in fact, the human mobility in the region has really run in parallel with to trade, and remains until today circular, labor motivated, and regional. And when we look into detail of this, again, IOM data that I presented earlier, if we look into detail of these numbers that we saw on our chart, we know that 75%, more than 75% of the people who were crossing from Niger to Algeria and Libya and back were in fact Nigerians. And their share has only increased after 2016. As much as mobility in the region remained irregular, it was not, in fact, illicit. So on the one hand, we had transporters who operated with the oversight of law enforcement, with military convoys accompanying transporters during their travel through the desert. And on the other hand, we had local Tuareg transporters who were incorporated into local governance structures in the Agadez region in northwestern Niger after the following Tuareg rebellions in the 1990s. So we really had a form of cooperation that linked transporters to local governments to law enforcement personnel. So looking at the facilitators and who participated in the facilitation beyond these transporters, it's estimated that in Agadez, 6,000 people had an activity that related to migration, and that half of the city's population benefited indirectly from the presence of migrants. People, including women, provided services, food, accommodation, and other services to migrants. Women in particular were present in the so-called ghettos or migrant accommodation campaigns, where they were providing services, cooking, cleaning, other services, as well as care to migrants. And so we see that a lot of people were in fact involved in providing services to migrants in transit, which went beyond transportation. So what happened to these local communities after law enforcement operations? We know that neither law enforcement nor the COVID pandemic will really manage to bring irregular migration to a halt. But many people in the local community who used to perform services that were linked to the presence of migrants had to turn to other alternative income generating strategies. So that's what we will try to cover quickly. Some people turn to former income generating strategies such as small scale agriculture in the region of the Aïr, which is in the north of Agadez. People have either invested in a plot of land or hired a laborer or worked to fill themselves to sell the harvest, or they rely on it for subsistence. We also have a lot of people who joined what's called the gold rush in northern Niger. It's estimated that about 70,000 men, mostly men, travel to extraction sites in the northern part of the country, in Chiparakatan and Jado. But we also have reports of women joining their husbands or male relatives to the extraction sites and setting up food stands, for instance. Some people have also tried to find employment, including women, in the uranium sector in the region of Arlit. But these strategies rely on two preconditions that are often not guaranteed for everyone. The first is that people need to be able to make an initial investment to make the trip to the extraction site or to the area region, as well as to finance the equipment that they need for these activities. And the second is that these people need to be able to travel through the country. And we know again that the northern checkpoint in Agadez has reportedly stopped people from traveling toward the north of the country, including Nigerian nationals. or people have had to bribe officials at the checkpoint in order to make the crossing. So the reality is that many other people remain unemployed and have had no other option than to reduce their expenses, their living standards, sell assets, plots of land, cattle, and others, or rely on debt and the support of their family. We know that 300 people, according to what we know from the trust fund, 300 people benefited from the so-called reconversion plan funded by the UTF. No women, we don't know of any women who have benefited from the plan, simply because their role in facilitation is often not acknowledged or recognized. But as I said, women have also had to cut down on expenses, find employment alternatives, and when not, they become heads of households with new responsibilities when their husbands have to migrate themselves to find employment in other regions. So I don't want to take too much more time, but based on what we've seen with the case of Niger, I wanted to make some recommendations that could perhaps inform future cooperation with third countries on counter-smuggling. Maybe this is my take on the public consultation. Right. So 4 brief points. The first would be, again, thinking of future cooperation more largely with third countries, which I imagine many of them will be in Northern or Western Africa. The first point, and I think some of them probably relate also to what Marcia just mentioned. First one will be to recalibrate the objectives of counter-smuggling policies. We've seen in Niger that counter-smuggling legislation went quite beyond the provisions of the Palermo Protocol. So the EU should make sure that new legislation that is enacted in third countries with EU support and at times EU funding this legislation should align with the provisions of the protocol. So this means 2 things. The first would be that legislation should guarantee, not only legislation, but also law enforcement operations should guarantee the rights and the protection of migrants being smuggled. This is something I didn't have a chance to touch on, but I'm happy to do so in the discussion. And the second point is that enforcement should also focus on the activities of organized criminal networks, which again, in the case of Niger, we've seen that oftentimes people who were convicted for smuggling were simply connected to 2 points of contact, not so much a network. The second point would be to research and monitor the impact of smuggling on local communities before and after counter-smuggling operations. We definitely need more research on the nature, again, Marcia pointed this out, on the nature of irregular migration and its facilitation, including how local communities participate in it. So that means men, women, at times children, families. We need this research to design counter-smuggling operations that are fit for purpose, that foresee the potential impact it would have on local communities, and the support that they may need. But we also need research on the actual impact, research and evaluations of the actual impact of counter-smuggling policies to understand how people have had to adjust, in effect, their income-generating strategies and where additional support might be needed. And quite interestingly, we've seen with the case of Niger that looking at the impact of counter-smuggling policies tells us a lot about who was previously involved in facilitation. The third one will be to adopt a new narrative on regional free movement, especially when it comes to Africa. It is true that the EU supports, in principle and also in practice, free movement, but there is also, we see an ambiguous narrative when it comes to free movement, especially in Northern, Western, and Saharan Africa, where the EU is also supporting the enactment of security and border policies that are at odds with, for example, with the case of Niger, the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. And this is also at odds more generally with the objectives of continental free trade and continental free movement that the African Union is pursuing. So the EU should align with the regional, legislation and broader policy objectives. And my Fourth and last point would be for EU counter-smuggling policies to allow for tailor-made and inclusive approaches to law enforcement, depending on the context in which they operate. So if we take the case of Niger, for instance, we had transporters and facilitators who were previously co-opted in local governance structures. They participated effectively in local governments. So this had a double objective of stabilizing communities post-conflict and of managing illicit trade and smuggling rather than to put an end to it. But after 2015, we've seen that those counter-smuggling operations have especially singled out the region of Agadez and perhaps awakened a feeling of ostracism among these Tuareg communities. And I think, and I'll stop here, I think this poses a larger question to EU policies in the Sahel region more broadly, which is, can we cooperate with non-state actors who are legitimate at their level, at the local level, but whose actions we disapprove of as the European Union? And I think this is also valid for Niger, perhaps Burkina, Mali, and other places in the region. I'll end it here, and yeah, I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alia, for your presentation and for, again, bringing up a fact that has been long forgotten in the way we talk about migrant smuggling, which has been the participation of women. I think that most of the literature has always envisioned or thought of as the smuggler, as a male. And what we have seen primarily in the case of North Africa, the Sahel, West Africa, is how communities, actually rely many times on the facilitation and how women are essential actors in this process. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I would really like to invite, I encourage all of our attendees, all of our participants to please use the chat box and to start entering, what you think will be key questions to ask to our panelists. Well, I also want to mention really quick, all of you received a copy of the Euromesco report. And along those lines, we really want to emphasize as well the work of our colleagues who are not joining us today, but who will join us at a different debate. Angeliki Dimitriadi, Kira Arush, and Matteo Capasso. All three of them have also worked in their specific chapters, also develop a lot of the work that has to do with some of the questions that have come up today. Issues of transparency, how information is actually accessed. Angelique's chapter does go into a lot of detail in terms of how some of the challenges that researchers face as we're trying to get some information, and also some of the challenges that law enforcement itself has at managing or learning how to do or what to do with some of the data that is collected. So we really encourage you to take a closer look at the report. And once again, we really encourage your questions today. And I think one just came through. So I'll just go and read it right there. It's thank you for this excellent webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My question goes towards a topic not specifically addressed today, but to Ms. Kuukka. Regarding information campaigns in particular, they are often cited as important components of counter-smuggling efforts. But there is still very little evidence on whether they are actually effective, as it's also discussed in Marcia's excellent book. Robust evaluations that are publicly available will be crucial to build the evidence base so that campaigns can be based or conducted in a way that can actually reach and support. But are there any plans to publish further existing evaluations of campaigns implemented for the Commission or for campaigns to be conducted under the future action plan? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, we are not currently planning on doing not an overall evaluation of the impacts of the previous action plan, nor looking into any of the specific actions. So I think the study that you mentioned by Seafair on the kind of trying to identify best practices of what has worked in the information campaigns is as far as we are currently planning to go. I know that the information campaigns, some of them have been more successful than others, but I think, yeah, like I said, the study by the consultant is as far as we are currently going. We will, of course, need to see future and how to, but of course, we think they're successful and we're planning to continue. And then, of course, they've been designed in cooperation with, for instance, with the EU delegation. So at least we're not doing them from Brussels without any local knowledge. So we do try to take the specific situations of the countries in which we do these information campaigns into account. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And while we wait for another question from our participants, I would like to maybe turn, ask a question to our panelists. I know that today there's a lot of, in fact, the one of the motivations that we had for this event was also to talk about data, the nature of the data when it comes to smuggling. I love how Marcia was so clear at telling us, what some of the challenges that that are connected with identifying data, with relying on data that is connected to migrant smuggling. So I was wondering if either Sanna or Alia or Marcia again, have any observations or any thoughts about the nature of the data that you deal with when it comes to migrant smuggling on an everyday basis, or Alia, in fact, the kind of data that you used for the chapter. And also perhaps for, if you want to comment on that for the people who are joining us today, and I would throw again that one to Alia. And as a researcher, what are some of the challenges that you have seen at identifying some of that data? Thank you.
Should I start, or Marta, do you want to? Okay, maybe, yeah. Thank you, Gabriela. This is also a chance, I guess, to say a few words about the methodology used for this research. This was the research, the data collection took place as the COVID had already hit us. So of course, field work as such, meaning direct interactions with, as I had imagined, with the people involved or participating in a facilitation, were not possible. So I had to rely on telephone interviews with people based in Niger. When it comes to access to, as a researcher, I guess, access to these people, this was made, of course, complicated by the setup that I was using of relying on telephone interviews, which means that some people were simply out of reach beyond, the coverage of the telephone or data network. But there is also a larger problem which had to do with anonymity and people fearing to get in touch with the researcher because their activity was in fact now illegal under Nigerian law. So I heard a lot of people who said that they knew they had relatives, they interacted and used to work with facilitators or in facilitation, but were very reluctant on giving more detail or contact to these people. So that's also actually something that we saw with the reconversion plan, the EU plan that was funded by the UTF for former smugglers, which was that people were reluctant on coming forward simply because they used to engage in what was now titled or labeled as a criminal activity. That's one element. When it comes to data availability, I think Marcia also covered quite a lot of ground when it comes to what kind of sources we can rely on. There's a lot of information out there that relates to how migrant smugglers are often at the center of this polycriminality, several criminal networks, but there's actually little evidence behind this to back such claims. So I found that actually using ethnographic research was also quite interesting, although very niche and very specific to a given context, was often very useful to understand lived realities and lived experience of people on the smuggling, so facilitating, and people being using those services.
Thank you so much. Marcia?
Yes, thanks very much, Gabriela, and thanks, Ali, for this point as well. Let me just go quickly back to Katarina's question on information campaigns, just some quick information, because we are continuing to also study the impact of information campaigns, perhaps not necessarily funded by the EU, but there's definitely a need to improve evidence on different types of information campaign, the impact that they have, and also to follow this impact over time, right? Because one thing is studying the impact of an event to inform migrants on the risks of irregular migration, the right that day, the moment after the event takes place, a month after, but it's much more difficult to follow this over time and actually see whether this initial change in the perceptions of risks that we've definitely noticed in our studies and that are mentioned in the volume, it actually stay, right? And what are also the other needs for information that migrants face on this route. And so we are conducting currently, also together with colleagues in our regional office in Dakar, an evaluation of the Migrants as Messenger campaign. So that's continuing. And also the separate campaign in Ethiopia called Community Conversations, where really information campaigns are implemented much more at the local level with community leaders, etc. So we, yes, Katarina, if you're interested, I can share maybe more information about this separately as well. On the point of data, maybe something that, couple of points that I didn't have the time to mention, and as always, I drag on and on in the presentations, but a couple of points maybe, since we also have a few people on the shift that's still there from Facebook. One is the potentials of using new data sources, non-traditional data sources to study or understand irregular migration trends and migrant smuggling. Now, this is obviously very sensitive, and we have to do this in being very conscious and very mindful of the data protection implications and also the ethical implications of studying smuggling and irregular and undocumented migration through the use of new data sources. But we're doing a lot of work in this regard, and we definitely see a lot of potential, for instance, on using social media data to at least understand, for instance, migration trends, including irregular migration in certain countries, information that can be used to improve also assistance and protections to protection to migrants in vulnerable situations as well, potentially, and also understanding how smuggling business operate. And there's a chapter about this in the study that Alia just presented a chapter on. But yes, there are obviously serious ethical concerns that need to be considered. So huge potential, but also a lot of implications in terms of using how to use these data sources responsibly to understand irregular migration. But in a context, for instance, like COVID-19, where a lot of traditional data collection systems and mechanisms have been disrupted, this can definitely provide an important source of information. I'm thinking also of, focusing a lot now on access to COVID-19 vaccination plans in a lot of the countries, and understanding, obviously, also the needs of and making sure that no migrant is left behind, regardless of its status. It is important that we use all the sources that we have to estimate the number and locations of these populations correctly, to also, for instance, improve accessibility of vaccination plans. And obviously, as everything, these are tools that can be used in one way or another. So it's very important to be clear about the policy purpose for the use of these data sources. Yes, I think I'll leave it at that. These are the two points. Oh, sorry, no, the second point, because I mentioned information. The second point, sorry, that I wanted to mention on DTM and4MI data and sort of these data sources and the selectivity, right, of information that we get from this data, which are obviously driven by the operational needs of informing programs of assistance and protection to migrants on the ground, is that it would be great to also expand this, and this is something we mentioned in the volume, to migrants in different types of situation as well, and sort of helping to build a more comprehensive, balanced understanding also about migration in these regions, which is not only about risks and vulnerabilities, which are definitely there and definitely need to be addressed urgently, but also the developmental aspects of particularly intra-regional mobility from West to North Africa as well. And this is extremely important to also make sure that we balance this narrative on migration more generally, which is not about something whose root causes we need to eradicate, but actually a process of human and sustainable development that can be facilitated for the benefit of all people involved and communities involved in countries of origin, destination, transit alike. So it would be important to also expand sort of these data collection mechanisms to cover other aspects that are not only really related to the immediate needs for assistance and protection on the ground.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Sanna, I don't know if you had a response to that question.
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly say what we are doing in terms of, because of course, yes, collecting data to provide a justification policy is very important, but it's also very challenging, like you've all highlighted. What we've been trying to do lately is to work together with Eurostat to improve the data which is there, which is the facilitation of unauthorized entry and transit, which is then split down by gender into different groups. But it's not really very useful at the moment because the Eurostat is not happy with the data quality that they're receiving from the member states. So there is further work needed on that. And that's what we're trying to do. And maybe on the law enforcement side, we are, of course, relying a lot on data that Europol has from the Migrant Smuggling Center on different things and trends and how the situation develops. I saw also on the questions that there are quite a few ones addressed to me. I thought there was one asking about the 3 new projects that I mentioned in my presentation at the beginning, which were the 3 new common operational partnership projects which started in March this year. Yes, indeed, there were 2 addressing Africa. There was one specifically focusing on the Gambia. And then there was one which is, I think, led by France, which is kind of setting a network of existing projects and trying to bring them together. So bringing together existing common operational partnerships and joint investigation teams in the area of Western and Central Africa and trying to kind of create a network and pulling together best practices and see what works and what can be more done. And then the third project, I think, led by Germany is covering smuggling and consignment in lorries and trucks in the Western Balkans and Turkey. I don't remember if there was something else. Repressive measures against smuggling, not very successful. Yes, I mean, maybe I haven't mentioned because the focus today was really on the future action plan, but I also work on the employer sanctions directive, where we are supposedly writing a report / communication on how to improve its effectiveness. I don't know if you all know the Employer Sanctions Directive, which provides sanctions against employers who employ illegally staying third country nationals. But on the other hand, it also provides protective measures for those illegally employed third country nationals, in the sense that they have the right to claim back the salaries. And if they don't have an employment contract, it's automatically assumed that the contract was at least 3 months unless they can prove otherwise. and that they have to have a right to make claims and lodge complaints if they are not treated well. So that's one of the things that we are trying to see if there's something we can do to try to make that side more effective in terms of repressive measures against smuggling. And in terms of legal pathways, I wish I was an expert on everything, but I know I have colleagues working on talent partnerships, which of course I think are addressing more highly skilled migrants. But something which is definitely relevant for lower skilled is the Seasonal Workers Directive, which provides the right for maybe lower skilled workers to get visa to come to work in the EU. I think they're mostly agricultural work in terms of seasonal, because it's called Seasonal Workers Directive. So that's something else. I don't know if there was something else. Sorry, I'm trying to look at my screen at the same time and read what else was there. But maybe I can leave it at that now, and then we can see further what comes up. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can definitely see if there's any other points that are raised. But I also think that it is important, to kind of like to take stock of what we have been talking about today. Precisely this lack or limited access that many times we have to data that is official and that is related to smuggling. And also, as Ali also mentioned, how specific many times, how niched some of this data may be. And how there have been, I'm here, I'm going to be talking from my perspective as an anthropologist, but how these sources of qualitative data have also been very effective at generating, raising many of these questions over who are we actually talking about. Then I'm going to bring up again the issue of gender, of race, of age. And there's been plenty of researchers who have documented the way in which young people and children are paying off their journeys, by performing different activities for migrant smuggling groups. And the fact that we monolithically, we tend to, that we think about migrant smuggling many times as just one form or one structure of criminal activity, obscures many of these complexities that, for me, I'm actually very glad that keep coming up. And in that sense, I've seen the list of participants to our seminar as well, a lot of very junior researchers, and female researchers who are very much interested in developing these questions. So thank you to all of you for raising the questions, and for being interested about what we can do, in fact, to contribute to better understand what migrant smuggling dynamics are like. And I would also like very much to encourage all of you to contribute to, since the Commission has opened the platform for us to express our perspectives, to contribute to those discussions. I think, once again, one of the points that we raise in the policy study as well, which is forthcoming, is precisely this fact that there is not a lot of voices when it comes to the way we talk about migrant smuggling. But we are very much encouraged, once again, by the presence of growing numbers of junior researchers and from other voices, people from third countries. We tend to talk to each other, and we're very happy to see friends, joining. But we would personally, we really encourage anyone who is interested in understanding empirically, in a way that is evidence-informed, the dynamics of smuggling, that really to really take a closer look at the action plan and what it is proposing. If there's it looks like there's no more questions right now in the chat box, but at the same time, I'm very much aware of the time. So I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and of course to Alia for hosting us today and for all of the work that went behind the scenes. So thank you to all of you for joining us today from wherever you are logging on from. And thanks again to Marcia and Sanna for joining. And we look forward to seeing you in the near future.